Okay, in this section of the course, we're going to learn about logical fallacies. Fallacies are forms of arguments that are obviously wrong. There's something about the argument that does not support the conclusion. There are many different types of fallacies. There are some fallacies that are defective because the argument is defective in some way. For instance, there is a formal fallacy. A formal fallacy is the argument is defective because truth is not preserved, right? Remember what I've said, that if true premises are true, the conclusion will also be true in any valid argument. That's the formal nature of logical proofs or logical arguments, that if the premises are true, the conclusion will also be true. So that's what it means by preserving the truth value of the premises. So sometimes an argument will be wrong because of a formal structure in the argument can lead to a false conclusion. We have seen some of those examples in previous sections. So a formal fallacy would be because the formal structure of the argument is faulty or defective, and you can get a false conclusion from true premises. There are also fallacies that are informal. And that's what we're going to be looking at for the next several slides. An informal fallacy deals more with the content of the argument, and the content of the argument does not support or preserve the truth of the conclusion. And this is generally the case with inductive arguments, but not always inductive arguments, but it's basically the way in which the argument is presented leads to sort of a faulty conclusion, or a conclusion that in one way or another does not follow from the premises that are supposed to support that conclusion. So we're going to go through a number of fallacies, and the first main section of fallacies that we're going to look at are called fallacies of relevance. Again, these are all listed in the textbooks, so they should be very familiar to you by now if you've gone carefully through the text. So the first are fallacies of relevance. And so what's crucial here is that in a fallacy of relevance, the premises are not relevant to the conclusion, right? So there's an assumption of relevance, that the premises support a particular conclusion, but there is not, in fact, a relevant connection between the premises and conclusion. So we're going to now start going through the 18 different fallacies that are listed in this chapter. So the first fallacy is what's called the appeal to force. In an appeal to force fallacy, there is an implicit or explicit threat of harm if one does not accept the conclusion. If I were to claim or tell someone, yes, I am a good professor, aren't I? Your grade depends upon it, after all. The implicit threat here is that if you don't accept the claim that I am a good professor, you will get a bad grade. Well, your reason for accepting whether or not I'm a good professor is not relevant to the fact that you might get a bad grade. That is not a factor that is relevant to whether I'm a good professor or not. So that's why it's a fallacy. This appeal to force does not hinge upon the actual criteria that's relevant to the conclusion. It focuses on something irrelevant to the conclusion. Appeal to pity is another common form of argument, and in the appeal to pity, one attempts to evoke pity or sympathy in a listener in order to get them to accept your conclusion. So if a student comes to the professor and says, I deserve an A because if I don't get an A, I will lose my scholarship money. All that may be true, but losing scholarship money is not a fact that's relevant to whether one deserves an A or not. It would be trying to appeal to the pity of the listener to get them to change their grade, not because they deserve a change of grade, but because of some other irrelevant factor. Hence, it being categorized under the fallacies of relevance section. Appeal to the people. This is basically drawing from the fact that we all desire to be liked by others, and this appeal to people is drawing on this fact as a reason for accepting a conclusion that others supposedly endorse. You often see this in ad campaigns. 9 out of 10 people chose this one over that one. So if 9 out of 10 people chose this one, then you are likely to want to choose it too. Well, the fact that a lot of other people like it is not necessarily relevant to whether it should be liked or not. So it's kind of feeds off of this sort of a herd mentality of people flocking together without necessarily looking at the factors that are relevant to a particular conclusion. The next one is argument against the person. This is the one that is often known by its Latin name, ad hominem. As you'll notice in the text, all the fallacies that we've gone over so far, and the ones that we'll continue to go over, have a Latin name, because a lot of the logic that we're doing here has been around since Aristotle and was perfected to a high degree during the medieval period, and all of these fallacies were known by their Latin name. But the ad hominem is the one that's more commonly known by its Latin name, so that's why I have it listed here. Well, an ad hominem argument is basically, it trashes the person and uses that as a basis for not accepting their argument. So, for example, we have this claim. This is from our text. Political operative Newt Gingrich has argued about the need to preserve family values. But who is he to talk? Gingrich has been married 3 times. He divorced his first wife while she was hospitalized for cancer, and he engaged in an extramarital affair while he was married to his second wife. Clearly, Gingrich's arguments are trash. Now, that may all be true of what's being said about Newt Gingrich, but those facts are not relevant to whether his argument about family values was good. Now, it may make him a hypocrite, and so these facts may be relevant to an argument that Newt Gingrich is a hypocrite, but it is not relevant to the argument itself. So that's the thing that comes up as an argument against the person. It's a very, very common fallacy that one will find, especially in politics, which is why that was an example that was chosen. Another fallacy of relevance is accident. This is what happens when a rule is applied to a case it was not intended to cover. We often have certain rules that we follow, and the rules are often very good, but rules don't always apply to all particular cases. And so if you find an exception to a rule and don't treat it as an exception, that could be a fallacy. For example, we could say people are obligated to keep their promises. That's a good rule to follow. But then we go on and we say, when Jessica married Tyler, she promised to stay with him for life. Therefore, she should stay with him now, even though he has become an abusive spouse addicted to gambling and drugs. So this would be an example where clearly we wouldn't think she should stay with him now that he's become abusive and addicted to gambling and drugs. So this is not an instance that the rule is meant to apply to. And you see some other examples that are given in the text. But the key point about accident is that rules don't cover all possible situations, that some accidents, right, things that don't fall within the rule, should be treated differently. Another form of fallacy is the straw man fallacy. And what a straw man fallacy does is it distorts an opponent's argument beyond recognition so that it's easier to criticize it. But the point is that this distorted argument wasn't the argument that was ever being made by the person. That's why it's a straw man. It's a position that was never actually defended. But if you pretend it was a position that was defended and then criticize that position, then you can make yourself look like you have the stronger argument. But you're not actually criticizing the actual argument that was being put forth. So here's an example. Mr. Goldberg has argued against prayer in public schools. So that's what Mr. Goldberg has done. So he has arguments against prayer in public schools. Okay, so if one were to argue against Mr. Goldberg, one would take his arguments against prayer in public school, okay, and look at the arguments themselves on that particular issue. But then what goes on here, however, is this. Obviously, Mr. Goldberg advocates atheism, but atheism is what they used to have in Russia. Atheism leads to the suppression of all religions and the replacement of God by an omnipotent state. Is that what we want for this country? I hardly think so. Clearly, Mr. Goldberg's argument is nonsense. So Mr. Goldberg most likely is not arguing that we become atheist and that we have an omnipotent state. That's not anywhere an argument that's being defended. And Mr. Goldberg may very well be religious and just simply is arguing against prayer in public schools. So this is an example of a straw man fallacy. Next fallacy is called missing the point. And what we have here is that the premises of an argument are irrelevant to the particular conclusion that is being drawn. So, for instance, if one has an argument, as we've seen from the very first section, the premises are reasons for a conclusion. So these premises support a particular conclusion. So the premises of an argument are irrelevant to the conclusion, meaning that they might support another conclusion, but not the particular conclusion that is being asserted in a particular statement or position. So for instance, we could say crimes of theft and robbery have been increasing at an alarming rate lately. The conclusion is obvious. We must reinstate the death penalty immediately. So we can say that crimes of theft and robbery have been increasing at an alarming rate. So that's a premise. But does those premises support the conclusion about the death penalty? It doesn't seem very clear that it does. So that's the sense in which these premises are not relevant to the conclusion that's being asserted. The red herring argument. The red herring argument is a case where the arguer diverts the subject to another one and then draws a conclusion from this new irrelevant subject. So for example, there is a good deal of talk these days about the need to eliminate pesticides from our fruits and vegetables. So if one is going to address that argument about eliminating pesticides, then one would need to look at the reasons for or against eliminating pesticides. But this argument goes on and says, but many of these foods are essential to our health. Carrots are an excellent source of vitamin A, broccoli is rich in iron, and oranges and grapefruit have lots of vitamin C. Now, all those facts may be true, but that's irrelevant to the argument about eliminating pesticides from fruits and vegetables. What one would need to do would be to look at the content of the pesticides issue and its relationship to agriculture and so on and so forth. What's being done here is diverting the subject from pesticides to the health value of fruits and vegetables. So it's changed the subject. That's why it's called a red herring argument. So now we move on to fallacies that are kind of related to induction, or what's called fallacies of weak induction. And the basic issue here is that the premises, it's not so much an issue of the premises being irrelevant to a conclusion, which is what we have been looking through, but rather it's the connection between the premises and the conclusion is not strong enough to support the conclusion. Okay, so there may be relevance between the premises and the conclusion, but it's not a strong enough relevance or connection to support the conclusion. So for example, we have the fallacy of unqualified authority. So we have Dr. Bradshaw, our family physician, has stated that the creation of muonic atoms of deuterium and tritium hold the key to producing a sustained nuclear fusion reaction at room temperature. In view of Dr. Bradshaw's expertise as a physician, we must conclude that this is indeed true. Now, first off, there is certainly a connection between the claims that Dr. Bradshaw is making and the conclusion that he wants us to accept. But the only problem is that Dr. Bradshaw is a family physician. He's not a physicist. And so we need to take with a grain of salt the truth of the claims he's asserting. So he's not in a position that enables him to really assert the truth of these claims. So that's what's called the fallacy of unqualified authority. Appeal to ignorance does make a definite conclusion from a fact that nothing has been proven either for or against a particular conclusion. So just because we haven't proven something, or disproven something doesn't mean we can make any definite conclusions about it. So, for example, this would be an example of a fallacy of appeal to ignorance. People have been trying for centuries to provide evidence for the claims of astrology, and no one has ever succeeded. Therefore, we must conclude that astrology is a lot of nonsense. Now, one may believe that this is true, but the argument here is not a valid argument. It commits a fallacy, because we could do it in the reverse way as well, right? People have been trying for centuries to disprove the claims of astrology, and no one has ever succeeded. Therefore, we must conclude that the claims of astrology are true. So this deals with cases that can either be proven or disproven, and one cannot make definite conclusions from those facts. The next fallacy is the fallacy of hasty generalization, which generalizes too quickly to a conclusion not warranted by just a few examples. So, for instance, before the last presidential election, 3 residents of Harlem were quoted as saying that they supported Barack Obama, even though they knew nothing about his policies. Obviously, the issues played no role in the outcome of that election. This is a hasty generalization just from a few residents of Harlem. To say something about the election as a whole is completely unjustified. And so that's an example of hasty generalization. False cause assumes a link between premises and conclusion that's thought to rely on a cause that probably doesn't exist. So, for example, there are more laws on the books today than ever before, and more crimes are being committed than ever before. Therefore, to reduce crime, we must eliminate the laws. So, obviously, that's a bad argument, and the basis for the argument is an assumption between laws on the books and crimes that are committed. So, if the more laws on the books, the more crimes there are. So, if we get rid of the laws, we'll get rid of the crimes. Clearly, the reason that this is a bad argument is because there's no causal link between the laws in the books and crimes that are committed. So that's an example of a false cause fallacy. Now we have the slippery slope argument. The slippery slope argument is that the conclusion of an argument rests on an alleged chain reaction with little reason to think that this chain reaction will actually take place. So for example, if we pass gun control laws to outlaw the use of military assault rifles, then the government will end up coming for all our guns. We don't want to have the government coming for all our guns, so we must not pass any gun control laws. So the idea here is that if we pass this one regulation against military assault rifles, then we'll end up with this chain reaction all the way to complete government takeover of all privately held weapons. And there's no reason to think that that will actually happen, that there can be lines drawn, limits enforced, and so on and so forth. So that's what's called a slippery slope. It's very similar to sort of the straw man argument in terms of appealing to some sort of absurd or extreme conclusion that's unlikely ever to happen as a basis for accepting a certain conclusion. Then we have the weak analogy fallacy, where the similarity is not strong enough to support the conclusion, or that there is an important difference that's being overlooked. Earlier I talked about the watchmaker analogy as one of the arguments for the existence of God. David Hume, in his famous critique of this argument, argued that there is not a similarity between God and a human watchmaker, that the differences are too great for us to think that the argument is valid or follows. An example that's given in the book is that Amber's dog is similar in many ways to Kyle's cat. Both like being petted, they enjoy being around people, they beg for food at the dinner table, and they sleep with their owners. Amber's dog loves to romp on the beach with Amber. Therefore, Kyle's cat probably loves to romp on the beach with Kyle. Obviously, this argument overlooks some important differences between the fact that Amber's dog is a dog and Kyle's cat is a cat. So that's an argument from weak analogy. The last sort of collection of fallacies sort of are just a kind of assortment of fallacies for various reasons, and we'll just kind of go over these fallacies. And they're often very common. 2. One is begging the question. This is the illusion that premises support a conclusion is maintained either through an implied premise that is likely false or by reasoning in a circle, right? Reasoning in a circle is where you place what you want to prove into the premises as a reason for supporting the conclusion. Or you have a premise that's either really false or needs itself to be justified as part of the basis for accepting a particular conclusion. So, for example, take this. Clearly, terminally ill patients have a right to doctor-assisted suicide. After all, many of these people are unable to commit suicide by themselves. Well, what's being left out of this whole argument is the whole notion of whether suicide itself is justified. It simply assumes that suicide is justified, and because they can't do it themselves, then clearly they have a right to doctor-assisted suicide. So you can see it's begging the main question here, and the question is whether suicide itself is a justifiable approach. Another is the complex question, where two or more questions are asked with the appearance of being a single question. Most common example of this is the "Have you stopped beating your wife lately?" Right? This presumes an answer to the question about beating his wife, then asks a second question about whether he has stopped. In short, we can answer neither no or yes. So if he says, "Have you stopped beating your wife lately?" If you say no, then the assumption is you're continuing to beat your wife. If you answer yes, then the assumption is that you used to beat your wife. And the fact is that there are two different points in here which would have two different answers. And so that's what makes this a complex question. Next one is false dichotomy. It assumes a disjunctive syllogism when in fact there are more than two alternatives. So for example, either you buy only American-made products or you don't deserve to be called a loyal American. Yesterday you bought a new Toyota. It's therefore clear that you don't deserve to be called a loyal American. Clearly one can be a loyal American and buy a Toyota. It's assuming a disjunction where there really isn't one. So this is a common fallacy that one will find in many different arguments in literature and stated in public forums and so on. Another is suppressed evidence, where an important piece of evidence that may undermine support of the conclusion is left out. So here's an example. Most dogs are friendly and pose no threat to people who pet them. Therefore, it would be safe to pet the little dog that is approaching us now. But let's say what's being left out is that dog is foaming at the mouth and looks somewhat rabid. That would not be a dog that one would be safe to pet. Equivocation. This is a fallacy that occurs when a conclusion is drawn from one of two possible meanings for a word. So for example, any law can be repealed by the legislative authority, but the law of gravity is a law. Therefore, the law of gravity can be repealed by the legislative authority. Now, clearly, the laws that the legislatures create are different from laws of nature. So there's two different meanings of the word law, and they're applying them both in the same way, which is wrong. Amphibole is what happens when a conclusion is wrongly drawn as a result of a word or phrase that has an ambiguous meaning. So for example, Professor Johnson said that he will give a lecture about heart failure in the biology lecture hall. It must be the case that a number of heart failures have occurred there recently, right? So the ambiguity here is that a lecture about heart failure in the biology lecture hall. So it's not that there are heart failures that have happened in the lecture hall. He's lecturing about heart failure in the hall. It's that ambiguity that can sometimes lead to false conclusions. A couple more fallacies, and that will be it, just for the fallacies. One is of composition. This happens when an attribute regarding parts is transferred to the whole that is composed of parts. So for example, each atom in this teacup is invisible. Therefore, this teacup is invisible. Clearly that's false because the whole is different from the parts, and so we can't infer about the whole what is true of the parts. And another way of thinking about this is the fallacy of division. This happens when an attribute regarding a whole is transferred to the parts into which this whole may be divided. So for example, the New Orleans Saints have been around for 50 years. Drew Brees is a New Orleans Saint, therefore Drew Brees is 50 years old. This is obviously not true. Drew Brees is not 50 years old. He's a part of the New Orleans Saints, and so on. So that's an example of the fallacy of division. I see here that my autocorrect didn't spell Breeze correctly. It made it possessive, but I guess my autocorrect does not know who Drew Brees is. But anyways, that does it for the fallacies. Do go through the textbook very carefully and study these and be able to identify them, so that in the exercises and then in the quiz, you'll be able to identify which fallacies are being committed. And so here's the exercises to follow. And again, these exercises will be listed on the Moodle page. Good luck.